Hi, I'm Jeff Dial, and welcome to another edition of Footprints in American History. I want to explain first of all the title, The Original Fact Checkers. Now, the purpose of a fact checker is usually like something political. If you have a politician debating another one, and one makes a statement of statistics or some kind of information, the purpose of a fact checker is to basically explain this is what the truth is, and if they told something that was inaccurate, it's to set the record straight. Now, in recent years, because of social media, they have a lot of people that are called fact checkers, and what's happening is they're doing a little bit more for changing the narrative. People will make a statement on social media, and then you have the fact checkers that come on there and say, no, this is the truth. And in actuality, it's very questionable, the information these fact checkers come up with. I will leave it at that. However, I want to talk about fact checking as in trying to upset the narrative, like as I just said with social media. And let's go back instead to World War II with their version of fact checkers. Now, you probably have heard of Tokyo Rose. Tokyo Rose was actually not one person, but probably a few dozen women that spoke English, and their purpose was to use propaganda to upset and demoralize American and Allied forces that were fighting in the Pacific War. Now, what they would do is they would tell men, your wives or your girlfriends are seeing other men back home, or they would talk about battles and battle losses and things like that. And the purpose was to make men lose the courage and lose their morale so that it would help the Japanese forces overcome. So that was a very dangerous weapon that the Japanese tried to do. Now, in the case of Tokyo Rose, the person that people most associate it with, it's a lady named Iva Toguri. Now, Iva actually was from Los Angeles. She was born in Los Angeles. She grew up in LA. Her parents owned a very successful business. She graduated from UCLA in 1941. Now, just before World War II, with the attack on Pearl Harbor happened, the United States was not at war yet. She learned that her aunt in Japan was sick. That was her mother's sister. So as a graduation gift, her parents sent her to Japan. They paid for the expenses so she could go tend to her sick aunt and help care for her. As things and the tensions began building between the United States and Japan, Iva realized she needed to get out of the country. Unfortunately, paperwork issues prevented her from getting on the last ship to come back to the United States. So she was stranded in an enemy country. And to make matters worse, a few days after that boat left, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and now we were at war with Japan. So she was stranded in the enemy country. Now, Japanese secret police, military police, were harassing her because she was an American citizen. They wanted her to renounce her citizenship and claim loyalty to the emperor, and she flat out refused. However, because of that, she was refused a food ration card. She had to find work. She had to find some way to live. And because of the police harassing her where she was, she ended up moving to Tokyo. Now, she had to find work there. She ended up working for a radio station in Tokyo, and they knew that she was an American citizen. So what happened was the Japanese started making her write these propaganda scripts. She was very fluent in English. She was a native of the United States, so she had to write these scripts for her enemies. During her time there, they asked her to start hosting on a show called The 0 Hour, which was what I just told you about, the show that was aimed at demoralizing American soldiers. So she knew that there was going to be people from her own country listening. She realized this. Now, one of the people she met at the radio station was a man who was known as Charles Cousins. He was actually a major in the Australian Army. He had been captured, and the Japanese wanted him to produce this radio show to demoralize the Allies. So he knew with her being an American citizen, they began kind of working together a little bit. Now, like I said, there were other women that were also reading things, and they really were telling things like your wives are sleeping with other men, or they're seeing other men, and they're saying these things to demoralize soldiers. However, Charles Cousins realized the power of radio. They realized that this could really affect our men that were fighting against the Japanese. So what Charles Cousins did was he decided to make the show as harmless as possible. Program music, do comedy and variety and things like that. He decided to make the show so harmless that nobody would take it seriously. And Tokyo Rose, as she became known, Iva Toguri, went along with it. So when she did it, she would try to make it a little bit more fun, and she ended up becoming a very much of a favorite with the U.S. soldiers and sailors. And I want to read to you a few of the things that she said. Now, after the war, she was accused of treason. She actually spent a year in prison. However, when the Army was not able to prove their case, they had to release her. Even though she had spent a year, they had accused her of the propaganda and trying to say harmful things. However, I want to read to you a few of the things that she said. And so she would warn people that this show is going to be propaganda. This is from history.com. She said, so be on your guard and mind the children don't hear, went one introduction. All set? Okay. Here's the first blow at your morale. The Boston Pops playing Strike Up the Band. In another broadcast, Toguri called her listeners my favorite family of boneheads, the fighting GIs in the Blue Pacific. Another time she stated, greetings everybody, she said during one broadcast in 1944. This is your little playmate, I mean your bitter enemy, Anne. She called herself Orphan Anne, just so you know. She sometimes called herself Anne. Usually she referred to herself as Orphan Anne. She never called herself Tokyo Rose. That was a nickname that the American GIs gave her because she was so popular listening with them. So she said, this is your little playmate, I mean your bitter enemy, Anne, with a program of dangerous and wicked propaganda for my victims in Australia and the South Pacific. Stand by, you unlucky creatures. Here I go. It should be noted that she actually tried to stay away from talking about your wives or seeing other men because she knew the effect it would have. So she tried to make it a little bit more on the harmless side in agreement with what Charles Cousins wanted to accomplish, as he also was being forced to do this. So the war ended, as I explained. She ended up spending a year in prison. Lack of evidence set her free. Now let's fast forward to a man named Walter Winchell. He was a very popular radio commentator. He was also a gossip columnist in several newspapers. And he began really putting out the word and speaking against her. Now, Walter Winchell was kind of a little bit on the mean side. His nickname was the Louse, and sometimes he was referred to as the Louse that roared. He began campaigning against Toguri, and he wanted to have her arrested for treason. Well, what happened was the president, Harry Truman, was so pressured because of Walter Winchell that she was arrested. Now, the first time she was arrested, she was out of the country, so she actually came back to the United States as a prisoner. She was tried for treason. However, out of the 8 counts, there was only one that she was ever convicted on. And in the end, a few years later, it was learned that the witnesses that gave the most harmful testimony that ended up sending her into prison, it turned out that the witnesses were actually trained of what to say. They were actually badgered, and they were actually afraid of what would happen to them if they did not go along with what they were instructed to say on the witness stand. In 1976, President Gerald Ford pardoned her. She ended up living in Chicago after that. She finally got her citizenship back. She had the charges dropped because of Ford's pardon. Now, next week, we're going to talk about another person, and that's Axis Sally. So she will be the second in the story, part 2 of the original fact checkers. In the meantime, my name is Jeff Dial. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please like and share the video. Please subscribe to the channel, and please also ring the bell if you want to get future notifications whenever videos are released. In the meantime, thank you so much. Fair winds and following seas.